Out here, the Medlin Ranch is the only place where cowboys check their herd beside the world's most secretive military base, and carry a classified radio just to cross their own grazing land. While Steve and Glenda Medlin built a 750-head cattle empire from bare Nevada desert, alien hunters rolled in, convinced the infamous black mailbox could connect them to visitors from another world. When the Air Force seized 89,000 acres, this family faced losing everything to government secrecy and UFO mania alike. How does one ranch become the crossroads of survival, suspicion, and legend? This is inside Medlin Ranch, the cattle operation on the edge of Area 51. In 1973, Steve and Glenda Medlin drove their pickup into Tikaboo Valley, staring out at a sun-bleached plain where even the tumbleweeds looked thirsty. The land offered just 80 acres of deeded ground, a single watering hole, and nothing else for 25 miles in any direction. No neighbors, no power lines, no telephone poles, not even a mailbox. Their children learned to read by the flicker of Coleman lanterns. Every evening a lesson in patience and grit. The only sounds at night were the wind, the distant call of coyotes, and the soft breathing of cattle huddled near the water. The Medlins hauled in lumber and supplies over rutted dirt tracks, building shelter by hand. Water was the first and last problem every day. With only one natural source, Steve spent his days searching for new spots to dig, sometimes finding nothing but dust and disappointment. The desert offered little forgiveness. Temperatures swung from freezing dawns to afternoons above 100 degrees. Any mistake, a broken pump, a missed calving, could cost them a season's work. Supplies came from Alamo, an hour's drive to the south, so every trip to town became a major operation. If a part broke, it meant a day lost and cattle waiting. The Medlins rationed everything: gasoline, feed, even their own energy. The nearest school sat too far for daily travel, so Glenda taught the children at home, lessons punctuated by chores and the steady rhythm of ranch life. There were no quick calls for help, no doctors on standby. When illness struck, they relied on each other and whatever medicine they had on hand. The land itself was hard, with thin soils and stubborn brush. Steve learned to read the subtle signs: where grass might come up after a rare rain, where a cow would hide to calve, how to spot the faint trails that led to water. He walked the range on foot, counting cattle, fixing fences, and memorizing every rise and wash. Each new watering spot he managed to establish meant the difference between survival and failure. Over time, these small victories added up, stretching the reach of the ranch mile by mile. The Medlins' world was bounded by the horizon and the limits of their own endurance. Every improvement, a new trough, a patched roof, a working windmill, came from sweat and stubbornness. They built what they needed, adapted to what they couldn't change, and trusted in their own judgment when no one else was around to offer advice. In a place where the desert could erase a man's work overnight, the Medlins kept building one fence post at a time, determined to carve out a living where most folks saw only emptiness. Water is the line between life and death in the Nevada desert, and Steve Medlin knew it from the first day he set foot on his new range. The land stretched 30 miles in every direction, but a single watering hole could not carry a herd through the summer. So Medlin started digging, literally and figuratively, into the problem. Each new well meant hauling pipe and pumps over ground so rough it would rattle the teeth out of a tractor. If the drill bit hit rock or the water came up brackish, it was back to square one. But when he struck a good source, it was a small victory that opened up another piece of the desert for grazing. Over the years, those victories multiplied. Medlin and his crew, sometimes just family, sometimes a hired hand, built more than 70 watering stations across a checkerboard of federal allotments and private patches. Some troughs drew from deep wells, others from shallow springs that only flowed after a wet winter. Every station needed a tank, a float valve, and fencing tough enough to keep out wild horses and burros. The network grew slowly, each new outpost expanding the reach of the herd a few more miles. By the late 1980s, Medlin's cattle could range across nearly 900 square miles, following the water from one end of Tikaboo Valley to the other. Electricity did not come standard out here. The closest power line was a day's ride away, and diesel for generators was too costly to haul in bulk. So Medlin turned to the sun. He rigged solar panels on wind-bent poles, wired them to batteries and pumps, and let the desert do the work. On a good day, the sun ran water for the cattle and lights for the house. On a bad day, it still beat darkness and silence. The solar setups needed constant tinkering. Dust would coat the panels, wires would fray in the heat, coyotes would chew through insulation, but they kept the water moving. By the time most ranchers in Nevada were just starting to think about solar, Medlin's outfit was already running on it. A herd of 750 head needs more than grass. It needs a manager who can read the land and adjust with the seasons. Medlin rotated cattle across the range, moving them to fresh pasture before the ground got chewed down to dust. In dry years, he would truck part of the herd to leased ground in other counties, swallowing the cost to save the land for another season. Each move was a gamble. Too late, and the cattle would lose weight. Too soon, and the forage went to waste. But the system worked. Calves grew strong, cows stayed healthy, and the desert held on. Every improvement was a bet against the odds. A new trough meant less walking for the cattle, which meant better gains come weaning time. A patched pipeline could save 1,000 gallons a week from leaking into the sand. Medlin kept records on every well. When the pump was last serviced, how much water it produced in July, which years it ran dry. Nothing was left to chance because out here, a single failure could cost a whole season's profit. By the time the Air Force came knocking, the Medlin operation had become a machine built out of sweat, steel, and sunlight. 70 watering spots, solar power at every outpost, and a herd that could survive where most would not even try. The ranch was more than a family business. It was a living map of ingenuity. Every mile earned the hard way, and every drop of water, every panel soaking up the Nevada sun, was proof that even on the edge of nowhere, a good hand could make the desert work. In 1984, the Medlin ranching operation faced a new kind of boundary. The United States Air Force seized 89,000 acres of public land, fencing off ground that had carried Medlin cattle for more than a decade. The official word was national security, but for Steve Medlin, it meant losing access to water tanks, grazing routes, and the best winter grass on the range. The government did not offer much explanation, just a new fence line and a warning. Trespassers would be stopped at gunpoint. The expansion doubled the buffer around Area 51, swallowing up land that had been open country since the first cattle trails crossed Tikaboo Valley. No rancher in Nevada had ever been forced to negotiate with a classified military base. Steve was not handed a contract or a settlement, just the promise that it was never going to make no difference. But he knew better. He pressed for a deal, some way to keep tending his herd without losing everything he had built. The result was an agreement as strange as the landscape itself. The Air Force handed Steve a government radio, a direct line to the most secret facility in America. Before entering the restricted zone to check cattle or fix a windmill, Steve had to call in, announce his intentions, and wait for clearance. Sometimes the voice on the other end would tell him to hold off. Classified work was in progress and the cattle would have to wait. Other times, the all clear would come, and he would cross into territory where even the county sheriff needed special permission. The grazing permit that came with the deal allowed up to 250 head to cross into the forbidden zone. Every move was logged, every trip coordinated with men whose job was to keep secrets, not manage livestock. The radio itself was a symbol of compromise. Not quite trust, not quite surveillance, but a tool that let ranching and national security coexist, at least on paper. For Steve, the radio was both a lifeline and a leash. It kept his business alive, but it also meant that every decision, when to move cows, when to haul water, ran through a chain of command that started far above the fence line. There was no precedent for this kind of arrangement. The government did not put it in writing, and the rules could change without notice. But it was better than losing the range altogether. Steve learned to work with the system, adapting his routines to the rhythms of a base that did not officially exist. The price was constant uncertainty, the knowledge that one missed call or a change in policy could shut him out for good. But in the high desert, where survival depends on making the best of what you are given, the radio deal bought the Medlins another season, another chance to keep the cattle moving on ground that now belonged to America's most secret operation. In November 1989, a Las Vegas television broadcast sent shockwaves far beyond the Nevada desert. Bob Lazar, a self-described physicist, appeared on KLAS TV and claimed he had worked at a facility near Groom Lake, reverse engineering flying saucers for the US government. He spoke of alien technology, Element 115, and scheduled test flights over the secret base. Within days, the world's attention zeroed in on a place most folks had never heard of, Area 51, and just down the highway, the Medlin ranch found itself pulled into the glare. Up until then, the Medlins had been running cattle in the shadow of the restricted zone, more concerned with water pumps than flying saucers. But Lazar's televised interviews changed everything overnight. The quiet mail stop on Highway 375, meant only for Steve's bills and feed catalogs, became a destination. UFO hunters from as far away as Europe and Japan started showing up, parking their campers along the fence line, scanning the night sky, and swapping stories about government secrets. Some came with cameras and telescopes, others with lawn chairs and high hopes. The desert, once silent except for the wind and the lowing of cattle, began to buzz with midnight vigils and talk of little green men. Reporters and curiosity seekers followed, drawn by the promise of answers to questions no one could quite prove. The Medlins watched as their stretch of open highway turned into a crossroads for the world's strangest pilgrimage. The mailbox, black, dented, and barely big enough for a week's worth of mail, suddenly became a landmark. Tourists snapped photos, left letters for aliens, and debated whether the box was a secret government drop point. Some even believed it was the direct line to Area 51 itself. Never mind that it belonged to a rancher who just wanted his mail to arrive in one piece. Steve and Glenda kept to their routines, hauling water and fixing fences, but the world around them had changed. The phones started ringing with requests from journalists and film crews. Strangers camped out at the mailbox waiting for lights in the sky. The Medlins hadn't asked for the spotlight, but there was no turning it off. What had started as a cattle operation on the edge of nowhere now sat at the center of a global mystery. And every day, the line between ranching reality and UFO legend grew a little blurrier. By the mid-1990s, the Medlin mailbox had become a magnet for every flavor of curiosity seeker, conspiracy theorist, and midnight wanderer drawn to the edge of the unknown. What started as a battered black box for feed bills and family letters turned into the most famous mailbox in America, shot up, pried open, and emptied by strangers convinced it was a hotline to Area 51. Steve Medlin found himself patching bullet holes with scrap metal and duct tape, only for the box to take another round the next weekend. Tourists left letters addressed to extraterrestrials, some hopeful, some unhinged, all stuffed in alongside the Medlin's actual mail. More than once, Steve opened the box to find it picked clean, his checks and correspondence scattered or gone entirely. The mailbox's battered state became a roadside attraction, but for the Medlins, it was a running headache. Every week brought a new batch of visitors, some snapping photos, others testing their luck with a crowbar or a .22. Steve tried a heavier lock, then a new paint job, but nothing slowed the tide. By 1996, the situation had gone from nuisance to liability. That year, after the latest round of vandalism, Steve replaced the mailbox with a heavy-duty white box made from bulletproof steel. The new box weighed close to 100 pounds and sported a reinforced lock. It was built to withstand Nevada's worst and, just as important, the growing crowd of UFO pilgrims who treated it like a sacred relic. Still, Steve understood that the mailbox had taken on a life of its own. To keep the peace, and maybe protect his real mail, he bolted a second, smaller box alongside the main one, labeled Alien Mail. This box became a de facto drop slot for tourist notes, drawings, and offerings to whatever they thought was watching from the other side of the fence. The arrangement suited everyone. Visitors got their ritual, and the Medlins could finally get their mail without sorting through a pile of tinfoil hats and cosmic postcards. The mailbox, now white and scarred but still standing, became a symbol of the absurd crossroads where ordinary ranch life met the world's wildest imaginations. Steve Medlin never asked for the attention, but he met it with the same stubborn practicality that built the ranch in the first place. Out here, you adapt or you lose, and sometimes that means trading a black mailbox for a bulletproof one and letting the desert keep its secrets. September 2019 brought a kind of reckoning to Tikaboo Valley. The internet's wildest joke, Storm Area 51, had gone viral, promising that 1 million people would descend on the desert to see them aliens. For weeks, the Medlins watched as the numbers ticked up online, then waited to see how many would actually brave the dust and heat. When the day arrived, the reality proved stranger than fiction. About 150 people gathered at the main gates, some in costume, some with cameras, all watched by military police and the ever-present desert wind. Another 1,500 found their way to makeshift festivals in Rachel and Hiko, drawn by the music, the stories, and the hope of a glimpse beyond the fence. The Medlin's mailbox, once just a battered post on the side of the highway, became the unofficial checkpoint for the curious and the committed. Campers lined the road. Drones buzzed overhead. For a few days, the quiet valley pulsed with voices from across the country and beyond. Some came for answers, some for spectacle, but all found themselves standing on the same patch of ground where cattle still drifted through sagebrush, unconcerned with the commotion. The Medlins handled the chaos with the same steady hand that had carried them through droughts and government seizures. They kept the cattle watered, answered a few questions, and watched as the crowds eventually thinned and the dust settled back onto the old mailbox. But something had changed. The world had come to their doorstep, not for the cattle or the land, but for the legend that had grown up around them. The line between ranch and roadside attraction was gone for good. That fall, the ranch appeared on the market listed at $4.5 million. The sale included 80 acres of deeded land, 2 homes, 70 watering stations, and the most famous mailbox in Nevada. The listing read like a catalog of survival: solar power, cattle handling facilities, grazing permits stretching into the restricted zone. Half the ground had been bought from the government decades earlier for 19 grand. Now the whole operation, history, headaches, and all, was up for grabs. No one could say who would take on the next chapter. For Steve and Glenda, 50 years of stubborn work had come to an end. Their legacy bound up with the secrets of the desert and the stories that would outlive them. In 1973, Steve and Glenda Medlin started with a single watering hole in 80 acres of harsh Nevada desert. Over nearly 5 decades, they built a 750-head cattle operation, engineered 70 watering stations, and negotiated the only known civilian radio access to Area 51. When the Air Force seized 89,000 acres in the 1980s, the Medlins adapted, balancing federal permits with survival. After Bob Lazar's 1989 interview, their black mailbox, once just a stop for the mailman, became a global landmark for UFO seekers. The mailbox evolution from battered black to bulletproof white documented the collision of secrecy, speculation, and daily ranch life. Today, portions of the Medlin Ranch remain off-limits, and the full story of Area 51's activities is still classified, but the facts are clear. For nearly 50 years, the Medlins bridged the gap between desert tradition and the world's most famous secret. The sale of the ranch in 2020 closed a chapter that no other American family has lived, a life on the threshold of mystery and reality, side by side.
In the shadow of Texas's Palo Duro Canyon, one man turned loss into legend. Before there was an American cowboy, Charles Goodnight, once a 9-year-old orphan, blazed a 2,000-mile trail, survived Indian wars, and seized a chance to build the J.A. Ranch, 335,000 acres, 100,000 cattle, and more land than entire cities combined. But the ground beneath his boots had been won in a final, brutal war that ended Comanche freedom and ignited a cattle empire with a single handshake worth what would be $12 million today. How did a story born from hardship and conquest become the blueprint for the American West? The answer changes everything you thought you knew about the cowboy, and it begins here. Charles Goodnight was just 9 years old when everything changed. In 1845, his mother packed up what was left of the family and headed west, leaving Illinois for the wild promise of Texas. His father had died of pneumonia years before, and the frontier offered no mercy for a boy without a father. The journey itself was a lesson in survival, 800 miles on horseback, crossing rivers and prairies that seemed endless. Goodnight rode a white-faced mare named Blaze, learning early that endurance was the only guarantee. The Texas they found was nothing like the world they had left behind. It was raw, uncertain country, still contested by the Comanche. The Goodnight family settled near the Brazos, where every day brought new trials. Charles had only 6 months of formal schooling in his life. Instead, his education came from the land and from the people who knew how to read it. An old Caddo named Jake took the boy under his wing, teaching him how to track, hunt, and move silently through the thickets. Jake showed him how to read animal trails, find water when it seemed there was none, and sense the weather by the way the grass bent in the wind. These were not just skills. They were lifelines, the kind of knowledge that kept a person alive when the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away. By the time Charles was 11, he was already working for nearby farms, riding fence lines and herding livestock for a few coins or a meal. At 15, he tried his hand as a jockey in Port Sullivan, but the work did not suit him, and he returned home to help his mother and siblings. The family needed every able hand, and Charles took on whatever jobs he could find, plowing, planting, even supervising enslaved workers on neighboring plantations. Each task was another lesson in responsibility, another notch in the slow carving of a boy into a man who could be counted on. The frontier did not allow for childhood in the way most would imagine it. Goodnight learned to shoot, to ride, to barter, and to fight if he had to. He watched as settlers clashed with Comanche bands over land and cattle, and he saw firsthand the cost of every mistake. The land itself was both a teacher and a test, and the lessons were often harsh. Hunger was a regular companion, and the threat of violence was never far. But Charles proved himself reliable. When his stepfather, Hiram Dougherty, needed someone to help drive the family's livestock or repair a broken fence, it was Charles who stepped forward. By his teens, he had become the family's main provider, a role that would shape every decision he made in the years ahead. Through hardship, he learned to trust his own judgment and to rely on the skills passed down by those who had survived before him. The knowledge he gained from Caddo Jake and the relentless demands of frontier life would become the foundation for everything that followed. In the crucible of loss and necessity, Charles Goodnight was forging something rare on the edge of Texas, a sense of self-reliance that would one day carry him far beyond the limits of his childhood into legend. By the time he turned 20, Charles Goodnight was already riding with the Texas Rangers, a frontier force known for their grit and their willingness to go where others would not. The Rangers were not soldiers in the regular sense. They were scouts, lawmen, and sometimes the only line of defense between scattered settlers and the Comanche bands who still ruled the open plains. Goodnight joined their ranks in 1857, earning his place not by pedigree, but by proving he could track, fight, and survive where others turned back. He learned to read sign in the grass, to move at night without a lantern, and to trust the instincts that Caddo Jake had sharpened in him as a boy. In December 1860, the Rangers rode out on one of their most storied missions. A young white woman, Cynthia Ann Parker, had been taken in a Comanche raid as a child and lived among them for over 2 decades. Goodnight's scouting skills helped the Rangers pick up the faint trail along the Pease River. The party moved quietly, knowing a misstep could end in disaster. They found the Comanche camp at dawn. The fight was short and fierce. Goodnight recalled the thunder of rifles and the confusion as warriors scattered into the brush. When the smoke cleared, Cynthia Ann Parker was found alive, clutching her daughter. That day, Goodnight's name became known beyond the Brazos. He was the one who could find what others missed, the man you wanted on your side when the stakes were highest. The Civil War brought new dangers to the Texas frontier. Goodnight served in the Frontier Regiment, chasing raiders and guarding settlements from both Comanche war parties and outlaws taking advantage of the chaos. The war years taught him how to organize men, how to move supplies across empty country, and how to keep a crew together when food was short and tempers ran hot. He learned to count every round of ammunition and to measure every mile by the water holes he knew from memory. These were not lessons from books. They were written in sweat and dust and the memory of narrow escapes. When the war ended, Texas was a land of opportunity and ruin. Cattle, left wild during the fighting, roamed by the thousands, unbranded and unclaimed. Goodnight saw a chance. In 1866, he met Oliver Loving, a seasoned cattleman with a gambler's nerve. Together, they planned a drive unlike any before, 2,000 miles from Texas to the railheads of Colorado and New Mexico. The route would cross rivers, deserts, and stretches of country where a herd could vanish overnight. Goodnight built a wagon for the journey, outfitting it with everything a man might need on the trail: coffee pots, beans, bacon, and a box for medical supplies. It was the first chuck wagon, and it would become as much a symbol of the West as the Longhorn itself. The Goodnight loving trail was not just a line on a map. It was a test of will. The first drive took months. Cowboys faced river crossings where cattle stampeded in panic, nights where wolves circled the herd, and days when water ran so low that men and beasts staggered under the sun. Goodnight rode at the front, scouting for grass and water, always calculating the distance to the next safe camp. He lost cattle to disease and thieves, but he brought the bulk of the herd through, proving that the open country could be crossed and that Texas beef could feed a growing nation. By the time the trail reached its end, Goodnight was no longer just a survivor of the frontier. He was its master tactician. He knew the country between the Brazos and the Canadian rivers better than any man alive. He understood how to move men and cattle across land that had broken many before him, and he had seen the Palo Duro country with his own eyes: deep canyons, hidden water, grass that seemed endless. It was land worth fighting for, and he never forgot it. The skills he honed as a ranger and trail boss, discipline, resourcefulness, and an unbreakable sense of direction, would soon find their greatest test in the canyons where the Comanche once camped and where Goodnight would build his empire. At first light on September 28, 1874, the silence above Palo Duro Canyon broke. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's cavalry, guided by Tonkawa scouts, crept down the zigzag trails into the heart of the canyon. Below them, spread across the bottomlands, stood a vast encampment, hundreds of lodges from Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne bands. Horses grazed in the mist, nearly every family's wealth and freedom tied to those animals. The Army's orders were clear: end the Indian wars, no matter the cost. The attack began with a single shot. Red War Bonnet, a Comanche lookout, fired his rifle to warn the camps, but he was struck down almost immediately. Panic rippled through the canyon. Warriors scrambled for weapons, women grabbed children, and the lodges erupted in chaos. The camps, scattered for miles, couldn't unite for a defense. Iron Shirt of the Cheyenne and Lone Wolf of the Kiowa tried to rally their people, but the soldiers were already among them, burning teepees and slashing open stores of dried meat. The air filled with smoke and the cries of families fleeing up the canyon walls. Mackenzie's men pushed deeper, torching everything they found. The cavalry wasn't seeking a pitched battle. They aimed to destroy the tribe's ability to survive the winter. The soldiers rounded up the horses, more than 1,400 in all, herding them into a single draw. The horses were the tribe's lifeblood, their only hope of escape or resistance. Mackenzie gave the order: shoot them all. The sound of gunfire echoed for hours as soldiers methodically killed the animals. By nightfall, the canyon floor was littered with bodies. Horses, not people, but the loss was just as final. The Tonkawa scouts took a few for themselves, but the rest were left where they fell. The destruction didn't end with the horses. Soldiers ripped open buffalo hide parfleches, spilling out pemmican and dried berries. They set fire to the lodges and burned the winter's meat stores. Blankets, tools, weapons, anything that might help the tribe survive went up in flames. The Army's aim was not just to scatter the people, but to erase their ability to return. By the time Mackenzie's men withdrew, the canyon was a wasteland. Only 3 warriors and 1 soldier had been killed in the fighting, but the real damage was measured in what could not be replaced. That night, as the soldiers camped on the rim, the survivors huddled in the cold, watching the smoke rise from what had been their home. The Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne who escaped the onslaught faced a choice between surrender and starvation. Palo Duro Canyon, once a sanctuary, was now stripped bare. The tribe's power to resist had ended with the loss of their horses and their food. By winter, most had made the long walk to Fort Sill, forced onto reservations far from their ancestral lands. The scale of the defeat was total. 2 centuries of Plains Indian dominance in the Texas Panhandle ended in a single day, not by the sword, but by the destruction of everything needed to live free on the land. With the canyon emptied, the fate of the country changed. The land that had sheltered generations of Comanche and Kiowa now stood open, its grass untrampled, its water unclaimed. For settlers and cattlemen watching from a distance, the path was suddenly clear. The last stand at Palo Duro had left the heart of the Panhandle vacant, waiting for the next empire to take root. October 23, 1876. Charles Goodnight reached the rim of Palo Duro Canyon with 1,600 head of longhorn cattle trailing behind him. The canyon below stretched for miles, its walls painted in red and ochre, the river winding through the bottom like a promise. 2 years had passed since Mackenzie's cavalry had driven out the last Comanche bands. Now, the only sounds were the bawling of cattle and the steady clop of hooves on rocky soil. Goodnight had scouted this country before. He knew where the springs bubbled out of the canyon walls, where the grass grew thickest, and where the bluffs offered shelter from the wind. He chose his camp with a tactician's eye, settling near the prairie dog-towned fork of the Red River, where water ran year-round and the land rose gently to meet the plains. The canyon offered more than beauty. Its steep walls shielded cattle from winter storms that swept across the Panhandle, and its maze of side draws made natural corrals for working stock. Timber grew in the draws, ready for building dugouts and corrals. The grass, untouched for generations, stood belly-high and rich. Goodnight understood that whoever controlled water and shelter in this country would control everything. He set about claiming the best spots, every spring, every patch of timber, every bend in the river that could support a herd or a line camp. He built his first dugout from cottonwood and cedar, using abandoned Comanche lodgepoles for rafters, and set up corrals with the same deliberate care he'd learned driving cattle up the Goodnight-loving trail. The legal paperwork would come later. For now, occupation was the law of the land. Surveyors like Jot Gunter and William B. Munson had already plotted much of the Panhandle, and Goodnight made deals to secure the choicest parcels, always pressing for land with water access. He scattered his claims across the canyon, making it nearly impossible for any rival to carve out a competing operation. The land was cheap, 75 cents an acre in some places, a little more in others, but Goodnight's real currency was timing. He moved in before the rush, staking out the canyon's heart while others hesitated. Every decision reflected years of hard-won experience. He kept his herd close, driving them into the side canyons for shelter and letting them fatten on grass that had never known a cow's hoof. He hired men he trusted, cowboys who could ride the rim in a blue norther or rope a wild steer in the brush. Supplies came by wagon from Dodge City or Denver, but the canyon provided most of what they needed: wood for fires, stone for coolers, and game for the pot. The dugout became headquarters, a beacon for the crews who would soon spread out along the canyon's 75-mile length. By winter, Goodnight's cattle grazed peacefully where just 2 years before, Comanche ponies had thundered and war lodges had stood. The transformation was swift but not accidental. Goodnight had watched the old order fall and recognized, before most, that the future belonged to those who could act quickly and read the land's true value. He didn't wait for government surveys or distant investors. He took the canyon by presence, by labor, and by a shrewd understanding of what made this country different from any other. In the months that followed, word spread across Texas and Colorado that Goodnight had claimed the Palo Duro. Other cattlemen would come, but none would match his head start. By the time John Adair arrived with his fortune and his vision of empire, the foundation was already laid. Goodnight had not just occupied the canyon, he had made it work for him, turning its wild geography into the backbone of an operation that would soon stretch farther than anyone could ride in a single day. In the canyon's silence, the next chapter of the American West was quietly taking root. The deal that built the J.A. Ranch started with a handshake in Denver, but it quickly became something far more substantial. On June 18, 1877, Charles Goodnight and John Adair put their agreement in writing, a 5-year contract that would transform both men's fortunes. Adair, an Irish financier with deep pockets and a taste for bold ventures, committed the capital. Goodnight, already known across the Texas Panhandle, brought his hard-won experience and the herd he'd driven into Palo Duro. The terms were clear. Adair would claim 2/3 of all property and profits, while Goodnight took 1/3 and a yearly salary of $2,500. To cover his share, Goodnight borrowed from Adair at 10% interest, a costly loan, but one he was willing to risk. Land was the real prize. Goodnight moved fast, buying the first 12,000 acres from surveyors Jot Gunter and William Munson for 75 cents an acre, with an option on another 12,000. He picked the choicest parcels, always with water and grass in mind. The ranch didn't grow as one tidy block. Instead, Goodnight scattered his claims across the canyon, staking out every spring, every bend in the river, and every patch of timber that could shelter a herd. It was a patchwork empire, stitched together by shrewd deals and a sharp eye for opportunity. By 1882, the ranch had expanded to 93,000 acres. Within a few years, it would stretch across 6 counties, covering 335,000 acres, more land than the city of Los Angeles and the entire state of Rhode Island put together. The numbers were staggering for the time. At its peak, the J.A. Ranch ran 100,000 head of cattle, each one branded with Adair's initials. The payroll listed 150 full-time cowboys, men who earned $30 a month and their keep, good wages for the frontier. The ranch's operations were as carefully organized as any military campaign. Each cowboy was assigned a string of horses, a bunk in one of the line camps, and a place in the daily rhythm of work that kept the ranch running through blizzards, droughts, and the endless demands of the range. Goodnight's management style set the tone for the entire operation. He insisted on discipline: no gambling, no whiskey, no fighting. Cowboys who broke the rules were sent packing. The ranch ran on respect, skill, and a sense of order that was rare in the open country. The headquarters complex grew to match the scale of the enterprise: a sturdy house of cedar logs, a bunkhouse for the men, a blacksmith shop, wagon yard, and a meat cooler that used the canyon's natural chill to preserve food. Supplies came in by wagon from Dodge City, but most of what was needed could be found or built on site. The J.A. brand became a mark of quality, recognized from the railheads at Dodge City all the way to the markets back east. Cattle drives left the canyon every spring, led by seasoned trail bosses and crews who knew the country by heart. Each drive was a test of organization and nerve, but the real strength of the ranch was its ability to operate at a scale few could match. The payroll, the land, the herds, everything about the J.A. Ranch spoke to a new era in Texas ranching, one where vision and capital worked hand in hand to create something that would last. By the early 1880s, the partnership had paid off beyond anyone's expectations. Profits topped $500,000, and the ranch's reputation was secure. The combination of Adair's money and Goodnight's know-how had built an empire, one that would set the standard for the American West and define what it meant to be a cowboy. A cowboy's day on the J.A. Ranch began before dawn, and it was order, not chaos, that set the tone. Charles Goodnight believed that civilization, even on the farthest edge of the frontier, started with systems. His most famous invention, the chuck wagon, changed everything about life on the trail. Before Goodnight, cowboys fended for themselves, cooking over open fires and eating whatever they could carry. In 1866, he repurposed a Studebaker army wagon, building a sloped wooden box at the back that folded down into a work table. Inside, drawers and shelves held flour, beans, bacon, coffee, and a battered Dutch oven, the core of every meal. A water barrel was strapped to the side. The cook, always the first awake, brewed coffee so strong it could float a horseshoe. The chuck wagon became the heart of the outfit, a rolling kitchen and social center that kept men fed and morale high, no matter how rough the country or how long the drive. Goodnight brought the same practical genius to the ranch itself. He set strict rules: no gambling, no whiskey, no fighting. Cowboys who broke the code were let go, no matter how skilled. The J.A. payroll listed 150 full-time hands at its peak, each earning $30 a month in their keep, a solid wage for the 1880s, equal to about $750 today. Goodnight expected his men to be professionals. He assigned each a string of horses, a bunk in one of the line camps, and a place in the daily rhythm of work. Line camps, scattered across the ranch's 75-mile sweep, allowed cowboys to watch over distant herds year-round. Some camps were little more than dugouts or sod shacks, but they offered shelter from the wind and a place to dry boots after a week on the range. Discipline ran deeper than paychecks and rules. Goodnight introduced a formal structure to cowboy life, with the trail boss at the top and a clear hierarchy below. Point riders, swingmen, flankers, and drags. Each role had its purpose, just as each tool did. The branding iron, the lariat, the Winchester rifle, all had their place, but so did the written records Goodnight kept on every head of cattle. He tracked breeding lines and calving rates, aiming to improve the herd year after year. In 1882, he built the Panhandle's first barbed wire drift fence, stretching across a canyon bed above the home ranch. The wire, twisted and sharp, changed the West forever. It kept herds from drifting in winter storms, separated purebred stock from the main herd, and made cattle theft harder than ever. Barbed wire was cheap, strong, and easy to repair. By the mid-1880s, the J.A. Ranch had miles of it, fencing off water, grass, and timber in a way the open range had never seen. Innovation didn't stop at steel and wood. Goodnight believed in better cattle, not just more of them. He imported Durham bulls to cross with Texas Longhorns, then shifted to Herefords after the Durhams disappointed. He kept purebred herds in fenced pastures, branding them with a JJ to track the bloodlines. His breeding records were meticulous, and the results spoke for themselves. Heavier, hardier cattle that fetched higher prices in Dodge City and beyond. The ranch even experimented with bison and cattle crosses, catalo, as Goodnight called them, hoping to blend the toughness of the buffalo with the beef of the cow. Every tool, every rule, every system was a piece of the larger design. Goodnight saw the cowboy not as a drifting laborer, but as a skilled worker worthy of respect and fair pay. The chuck wagon, the barbed wire, the breeding pens, and the line camps. These weren't just conveniences. They were the bones of a new order, one that turned wild country into working country and made the cowboy a symbol of American possibility. The systems built at the J.A. Ranch didn't just keep cattle alive. They built a culture, one that endures in every code of the West. 300,000 visitors make their way to Palo Duro Canyon each year, drawn by the same sweeping vistas and hidden springs that once lured Charles Goodnight. The canyon's floor stretches out for miles, its red walls rising high above a landscape shaped by wind, water, and the passing of herds. Today, the land echoes with different footsteps. Families on day hikes, school groups tracing the old cattle trails, horseback riders following paths once cut by cowboys. The park welcomes travelers with 16 marked trails, each one offering a glimpse of the wild country that became the heart of the J.A. Ranch. Some visitors climb the Lighthouse Trail, a winding route that leads to the famous stone spire standing over the canyon. Others camp beneath the rim, waking to the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, just as Goodnight's cowboys did a century before. Cabins named for pioneers, Goodnight, Sorensen, Lighthouse, sit perched above the canyon, their porches facing the sunrise. Reservations fill up months in advance, a testament to the enduring pull of this place. The park's amphitheater hosts the musical drama Texas every summer, telling the story of the Panhandle settlement in the very spot where Comanche camps once stood. For many, the real draw is the chance to walk where history happened. The canyon's trails pass over the same ground crossed by cavalry and cattle herds, by Comanche families and the first ranch hands. Here, the past feels close. Every visitor leaves their own mark, joining a long line of travelers who have come to see the birthplace of cowboy culture for themselves. The cowboy who rode for the J.A. Ranch became something more than a hired hand. Over time, his image took on a life of its own, spilling out of the canyons and into the national imagination. Hollywood found its muse in stories like these, spinning legends from the real men who once worked this land. Long before the cameras rolled, Charles Goodnight had already written the script. The rough code of conduct, the long cattle drives, the life built on skill and grit. Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove drew directly from the partnership between Goodnight and Oliver Loving, turning their journey into a saga that would win the Pulitzer Prize and anchor one of the most beloved miniseries in American television. The characters of Call and McCrae, shaped by the Goodnight-loving trail, brought the frontier's hardships and loyalties to living rooms across the country. Even in classic films like Red River, echoes of Goodnight's innovations, his chuck wagon, his trail boss system, show up in every campfire scene in Stampede. The real reach of the J.A. Ranch runs deeper than silver screens. In Texas classrooms, students learn about Goodnight's legacy as part of their foundational history. The Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills Standards require fourth graders to study the origins of cowboy life, and Goodnight's name appears in textbooks as the architect of the Panhandle's cattle empire. Teachers tell of the 335,000 acres, the first formal codes of the range, and the invention of the chuck wagon, a story that's as much about ingenuity as it is about survival. The story endures in other ways too. Palo Duro Canyon draws visitors who may not know they're walking the ground where cowboy culture was born. The summer crowds at the park's amphitheater watch the musical Texas, hearing tales that began with Goodnight's herd and the men who rode for him. Each year, a new crop of students, tourists, and would-be cowboys encounter the J.A. Ranch in textbooks, documentaries, and the stories that pass from one generation to the next. The myth of the American cowboy, tough, honorable, self-reliant, owes much of its shape to the real lives lived here. What started as a working code in a dugout on the canyon floor has become a symbol recognized far beyond Texas. That's the legacy of the J.A., not just a ranch, but the blueprint for an American legend. At its height, the J.A. Ranch stretched over 335,000 acres, more land than Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City combined. Charles Goodnight's transformation from orphaned frontier boy to architect of the American cowboy was rooted in hard fact. A $500,000 handshake in 1876, 100,000 cattle driven by 150 cowboys, and innovations like the chuck wagon and barbed wire that changed ranching forever. The Red River War of 1874 opened Palo Duro Canyon to settlement, but the full stories of Comanche resistance and the personal lives of J.A.'s cowboys are still partly lost to history, with many first-hand accounts missing from the record. Today, over 300,000 visitors walk the canyon each year, retracing the paths where history was forged. The J.A. Ranch model, documented in Texas textbooks and echoed in Hollywood, remains the blueprint for cowboy culture. The legacy of vision, hardship, and transformation on this land is as real and enduring as the canyon walls themselves.
In 1824, when most of America was still untamed wilderness, a single land grant carved out nearly 300,000 acres on the far frontier, launching Bell Ranch into history. Over 2 centuries, this cattle kingdom has survived 3 different governments, Apache raids that turned neighbors into casualties, and financial disasters that erased ranches 10 times its size. Today, the same brand still burns onto hides, the same land still tests every generation, and the world still does not know how any of it was possible. This is Inside Bell Ranch, 200 years and 290,000 acres of American survival. So what does it really take to endure when almost nothing else does? On November 8, 1824, Pablo Montoya stepped into the council chambers of Santa Fe with a request that defied the norms of his era. He petitioned the territorial deputation for a grant of land so immense it would span nearly 655,000 acres, an expanse that dwarfed most private holdings in the Americas. 11 days later, the council approved his claim, transforming a sweep of New Mexico's high plains and canyons into a private domain larger than many eastern states. The decree, signed under the authority of the newly independent Mexican Republic, granted Montoya not just land, but a kingdom in all but name. The legal framework behind this act was Mexico's General Colonization Law, passed only months earlier in August 1824, which aimed to populate and secure the northern frontier. The government, anxious to assert control over lands threatened by indigenous resistance and foreign ambition, offered vast tracts to settlers willing to risk the unknown. While the law typically set limits, 11 square leagues, about 48,000 acres, Montoya's grant exceeded those boundaries by more than tenfold. His standing as alcalde of Santa Fe and his connections within the territorial administration gave him the leverage to secure what others could not. The approval came with conditions familiar to frontier grants: the expectation that Montoya's family would defend the land and bring it into productive use, serving as a living bulwark for the Mexican state. The paperwork itself, preserved in a chain of Spanish and Mexican legal tradition, reads like a contract between a restless nation and a man willing to gamble his legacy. The boundaries were described in broad strokes, anchored by natural markers, rivers, mesas, and the bell-shaped mountain that would give the ranch its name. There were no fences, only the promise of presence and the hope that settlement would bring stability. The grant covered rolling grassland, rimrock canyons, and the winding course of La Cinta Creek, territory that had been traversed by the Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache for generations. Montoya's leap was more than ambition. It was a wager on survival at the edge of an empire. The Mexican government's strategy was clear: populate the frontier, create self-sustaining communities, and rely on grantees to hold the line where military garrisons could not. For Montoya and his family, the grant meant uprooting from the relative safety of Santa Fe and staking their future on a landscape as unpredictable as the politics of the new republic. The land was both opportunity and obligation, a place where the rewards of ownership came with the daily risk of loss. By the end of 1824, the Bell Ranch existed on paper and in the imagination of its new owners. The legal title was a promise, but the reality waiting on the plains was far from secure. Montoya's signature on the grant was an act of faith in the law, in the endurance of his family, and in the possibility that a single decision could shape not just his own destiny, but the fate of a region for centuries to come. Long before surveyors pressed their maps onto this land, the high plains and canyons of northeastern New Mexico belonged to no one and everyone. Each spring, the wind swept over grasslands broken by mesas and the solitary shadow of Bell Mountain. La Cinta Creek, winding through the heart of the future ranch, offered water in a country where rain could vanish for months. The Mexican Council's decree in 1824 drew new boundaries. But on the ground, the land answered to older rhythms. The ground Montoya claimed was not a blank slate. For generations, the Comanche, Kiowa, and Kiowa Apache moved through these valleys and across the open range. Buffalo herds shaped their migrations. Seasonal camps rose along the creek banks, and churrawine and trails cut through the grass where horses and families traveled together. The Canadian River Corridor was more than a landmark. It was a lifeline, a route for trade, war, and survival. Petroglyphs on distant canyon walls, hidden in the folds of red rock, stood as silent records of lives lived before the ink dried on any land grant. In the early 19th century, this region sat at the edge of Comancheria, a domain held by force and reputation. Comanche bands, numbering in the thousands, rode from the Arkansas River down into the Texas Panhandle and across into New Mexico. Their allies, the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache, shared these hunting grounds, each group staking seasonal claims, each defending their share of grass and water. The land itself was divided not by fences but by memory, alliance, and the unspoken rules of the plains. The promise of the Bell Grant was always shadowed by risk. Mexican officials in Santa Fe understood it. They granted such vast acreage precisely because they needed settlers to stand as a human buffer against raids. The grant's boundaries, anchored by rivers and the bell-shaped peak, cut through territory where no government's word held sway for long. Montoya's deed was a wager against the unknown, a legal claim staked in the face of a landscape that had never been tamed. This was a place where a sudden storm could strip the grass bare, where waterholes dried to cracked mud, and where a rider could vanish without a trace. The same grass that promised wealth for cattle was also the draw for buffalo herds and the people who followed them. Every new structure, every corral, every adobe wall stood exposed, not just to weather, but to the possibility of conflict. The land did not yield easily. It demanded vigilance, endurance, and the constant awareness that every gain could be swept away overnight. On paper, the Bell Ranch began as a bold stroke, an empire measured in leagues. In reality, it was a patchwork of hope and hazard, a frontier where the line between opportunity and danger blurred with each passing season. The land kept its own counsel, indifferent to the ambitions of newcomers, holding the memory of those who had come before and the warning that nothing here was ever truly secure. Night on the high plains brought no peace for the families who tried to stake their future on the Bell Ranch. In 1874, the land's promise of wealth turned suddenly to terror. 4 vaqueros, seasoned riders who knew every bend of La Cinta Creek, failed to return from their work. Their bodies were found days later, stripped of their gear, their horses gone. The killing sent a shock through the adobe walls of the ranch house, a reminder that out here, the law's reach faded long before the horizon. The attackers were Kiowa warriors, moving fast and silent across the same grasslands that had fed their people for generations. They struck not out of random violence, but from a deep well of grievance over vanished buffalo herds and broken promises. For the men and women of the Bell, the threat was constant. Every trip to check a waterhole or gather strays meant scanning the ridgelines for movement, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that didn't belong. The adobe headquarters became a fortress. Windows were set high and narrow, doors barred at sundown. Children learned to stay low, to run for the thickest walls at the first sign of dust on the horizon. At night, the adults took turns on watch, rifles propped by the door, every shadow outside a possible warning. The land that had been granted as a reward for courage now demanded it every day. News of the killing spread quickly through the scattered settlements of northeastern New Mexico. Some families packed what they could carry and left, unwilling to gamble another season against the odds. Others dug in, determined to hold what they had built. But knowing each day might bring another raid. For the Montoya heirs, the loss was more than personal. It was the breaking point. The promise of the Bell, so grand on parchment, had become a burden too heavy to bear. The deaths of the 4 vaqueros forced a reckoning. The Montoya family, who had survived drought, legal battles, and the uncertainties of changing governments, now faced a threat that no document could resolve. They chose to sell, ending their chapter on the land. The Bell Ranch passed into new hands, but the memory of that night, of the bodies found in the grass, of the fear that settled over the adobe walls, lingered long after. On this frontier, survival was never guaranteed, and every gain could be swept away in a single, silent raid. Wilson Waddingham arrived at Bell Ranch in the mid-1870s with a vision that reached beyond mere survival. The land had already tasted blood and loss, but Waddingham saw potential where others saw only risk. In 1875, he took a step that would secure the ranch's identity for generations. He registered the Bell brand, a simple iron mark shaped after the mountain that had watched over these grasslands since before the first fence post. That brand, filed in San Miguel County, became more than a mark of ownership. It was a declaration that Bell Ranch cattle would carry a legacy across every mile they traveled, unmistakable in crowded rail yards and on distant ranges. The act of branding was both practical and symbolic. In a territory where livestock theft was a constant threat and legal boundaries blurred with each new government, a registered brand served as a shield. The 1875 patent records show the Bell mark as one of the earliest continuous brands in the American West, offering legal footing in an era when property could vanish overnight. Branding laws in New Mexico territory were still evolving, but the Bell brand's distinct shape made it difficult to alter or forge. It protected herds from rustlers and gave buyers confidence in the cattle's origin. A crucial advantage as railroads pushed deeper into the frontier and the market for beef expanded eastward. Waddingham's approach to ownership was as modern as it was resolute. He brought capital from England, invested in breeding programs and improved range management, but he understood that the heart of any ranch was its reputation. The Bell brand became a promise, a guarantee that each animal was raised on these high plains, shaped by the same wind and weather that had tested every owner before him. As the ranch grew, so did the meaning of the brand. It was stamped not just on cattle, but on saddles, gates, and the very identity of the people who worked the land. Legal victories followed. The brand's registration gave the ranch standing in territorial courts, allowing Waddingham to defend his stock and land against encroachment in ways the previous owners could not. Where the Montoya family had relied on personal alliances and fragile paper grants, Waddingham built a system rooted in law and commerce. The Bell Ranch, once a vulnerable outpost, now stood as a recognized enterprise. Its boundaries mapped, its herds accounted for, its name respected from Santa Fe to Kansas City. The legacy of the Bell brand endures. It remains one of the oldest uninterrupted cattle brands in America, a living link to the era when survival meant more than holding land. It meant proving, season after season, that your claim would outlast drought, war, and the shifting currents of history. Waddingham's decision to formalize the brand was a turning point, transforming the ranch from a fragile inheritance into an enduring symbol of American ranching. Today, every new calf branded at Bell carries a piece of that legacy, proof that some marks are made to last. By the early 1930s, the Bell Ranch faced a test that toppled countless others across the West. Beef prices had collapsed, drought gripped the high plains, and most ranchers in New Mexico found themselves staring down debts they could not pay. Yet while neighbors sold off herds and watched their land slip away at auction, Bell Ranch made a different wager. In 1932, the board brought in Albert Mitchell, a college-educated manager barely 30, to run the operation for the Red River Valley Company. Mitchell's approach was anything but conventional. He split his time between Bell and his family's Tequesquite Ranch, piloting his own plane to scout grass and water from the air, a rare sight in those days. Mitchell refused to let drought or market panic dictate the ranch's future. When local forage vanished, he sent Bell cattle to graze in neighboring states, then as far as California and Pennsylvania. The logistics were daunting, but the alternative was liquidation, a fate that met too many ranches during those lean years. At the same time, Mitchell turned his attention to the ranch's backbone, its infrastructure. Corrals and wells that had fallen into neglect were rebuilt. Fences went up where none had stood before, dividing pastures to make the most of every blade of grass. Government programs swept across the plains, buying up inferior cattle and thinning herds. But Bell Ranch held on to its best stock, culling only what was necessary to keep the core strong. The Agricultural Adjustment Act brought a measure of relief, but survival still depended on hard decisions made at the ranch headquarters. Through it all, payrolls were met, families stayed on, and the brand endured. By the time the war years brought rain and rising prices, Bell Ranch was ready. The improvements made during the darkest years meant that when buyers came calling in 1947, the ranch stood as one of the few operations to emerge stronger than before. The quiet resolve of managers like Mitchell and the willingness to invest in the land even when hope seemed thin became the unseen engine of the ranch's survival. At Bell Ranch, the Bell brand is more than a mark. It is a living story, hammered into iron, pressed into hide, and carried forward by every generation that works these plains. The original branding iron, registered in San Miguel County in 1875, is still legal for use today. Each spring, the crew gathers at the headquarters, the same way their predecessors did nearly a century and a half ago, ready to brand the new calves. The fire crackles, irons glow, and the rhythm of work echoes across 290,000 acres, land stitched together by more than 530 miles of dirt roads, every mile a testament to the scale of daily life here. Modern Bell cowboys see themselves as stewards of something greater than the cattle or the grass. The brand book, kept meticulously up to date, records every animal marked with the bell, every lineage tracked, every promise kept. For these men and women, branding day is not just a job. It is a ritual of belonging, a handshake with the past. The same iron that once protected herds from rustlers now stands as a symbol of continuity. In an industry where change is constant and survival is never guaranteed, conservation is woven into their ethic. The land is managed with an eye for the long haul, rotational grazing, water management, careful stewardship of fragile grasslands. The Bell crew knows that the privilege of working here comes with the burden of responsibility. They speak about the future with the same respect they give the past, understanding that this place endures only as long as each generation tends both cattle and country with equal care. On branding day, when the smoke rises and the calves bawl, the weight of history is felt in every movement. The bell iron leaves its mark, just as it did in 1875, and the circle of tradition closes once more, unbroken, unyielding, and unmistakably Bell. In 1824, the Bell Ranch began as a Mexican land grant spanning over 655,000 acres, an expanse larger than Rhode Island. For 2 centuries, it has survived 3 governments, Apache raids, and the economic devastation that erased most of its peers. The original Bell brand, registered in 1875, still marks cattle raised on 290,100 acres today. Archival documents confirm vaquero deaths during frontier conflict, land patents signed in 1869, and the continuous operation through the Great Depression and modern ownership transitions. Yet, questions remain. Not all records from the Apache era have survived, and some details of water rights battles are still buried in county archives. What is certain is this: Bell Ranch is not just a business that beat the odds. It is a living record of American endurance, where documented tradition and stewardship carry forward across generations and changing frontiers. The evidence stands. On this land, history endures in every mile of fence and every mark of the Bell brand.
It is 1883 in West Texas. Cattle fortunes are booming, and land changes hands as fast as the wind. But at the Pitchfork Ranch, 2 men draft a radical charter: never borrow a dime, never sell an acre. Everyone says it is madness, until the great die-up blizzard hits, wiping out entire empires overnight. Somehow, the Pitchfork survives. For 140 years, this 165,000-acre giant has never fallen, never changed hands, and never taken on debt, not once. Today, cowboys still gather at the same table as those in 1883, riding out blizzards, market crashes, and the oil booms that could have rewritten ranching history. What did they risk, and what secrets kept this legend alive when nearly every peer vanished? December 1883 brought a new kind of Texas gamble, one played not with cattle or cards, but with pen and ink. In a borrowed St. Louis office, Eugene Williams and D.B. Gardner signed their names to the Pitchfork Land and Cattle Company charter. The text was plain, but the rules behind it were anything but ordinary. No bank would ever hold a claim on their land. No acre would ever leave the company's hands. The company would grow only by cash and caution, never by credit. Most ranches in the cattle boom stretched their luck with borrowed money and risky expansion. Williams and Gardner wrote a different code, one that would outlast drought, depression, and every market panic that swept the West. The original charter set the scale: 52,500 acres of raw Texas grass and 9,750 head of longhorns, all branded with the 3-pronged pitchfork. Gardner, a Texas surveyor with an eye for water and shelter, chose ground just under the Caprock, valleys carved by the South Wichita River with natural breaks to shield cattle from northern winds. Williams, a shoeman from St. Louis, brought business discipline and a promise. Every dollar earned would be turned back into land and cattle, never into debt. 6 men made up the first board, A.D. Brown as president, Williams as vice president, A.P. Bush Jr. as secretary, Gardner as general manager. When Bush resigned after the first year, Gardner took on the secretary's duties too, tightening control over every decision. The company's bylaws were strict but simple. Land could only be bought, never sold. Borrowing was forbidden. Profits were to be plowed back into the range. This wasn't just stubbornness. It was a shield against the boom and bust cycles that toppled so many neighbors. The headquarters rose near the middle of the spread, close to what would become U.S. Highway 82. From this center, the ranch could be watched in every direction. Camps were built at the range's edges, each one a day's ride apart. Gardner's system meant that no part of the herd, no waterhole, no fence line was ever out of reach. The new company was lean, but its structure was built for the long haul. No easy money, no quick sales, no outside interference. While others in the 1880s raced to stake claims and leveraged every asset, the Pitchfork's founders chose patience. They kept their books tight and their ambitions rooted in the dirt. When the first hard winter hit, their cattle had grass left to eat and water to drink. The ranch had no debts to call in, no mortgages to foreclose. Williams and Gardner's code, written into that quiet St. Louis charter, set the Pitchfork apart from the very beginning. It was more than a business plan. It was a promise. This land and everything on it would endure. The winter of 1886 arrived with a cold front that swept across the Texas plains and did not let go. For weeks, snow fell in sheets, drifts piled high against the wire, and the wind cut through every hollow. Across the west, cattle herds weakened by a dry summer found no shelter, no feed, and no escape. The open range, once a promise of endless grass, became a graveyard overnight. In the northern Panhandle, fences meant to keep herds in became death traps instead. Cattle drifted south, pressed against the wire in desperate knots, smothering and freezing as the blizzards raged on. Cowboys rode out and found carcasses stacked for miles, sometimes 250 per mile along the fence. Some ranches lost 3/4 of their herds in a single season. The Diamond C and Bar CC were nearly wiped out. Panic swept the cattle towns, bankers called in loans, and the smell of dead cattle hung over the land well into spring. Yet on the Pitchfork, the story played out differently. Gardner's choice of ground, those valleys tucked under the Caprock, with breaks for shelter and the South Wichita running through, gave the herd a fighting chance. When waterholes froze, there was still running water in the river. Where the wind scoured the open prairie, the Pitchfork's draws and ridges broke the worst of the storm. The cattle here had not been pushed to the edge by overstocking or drought. There was grass left to paw through, and enough cover to survive the coldest nights. The books stayed closed to the banks. No creditors arrived to tally up the losses. While neighbors watched their spreads carved up by foreclosure, the Pitchfork's land remained whole. No mortgages, no forced sales, no outside hands dictating the future. The company's bylaws, stubborn as they seemed, had become a lifeline. No land sold meant every acre was still in play for recovery. No debt meant the ranch could weather the storm without surrendering its independence. When the thaw finally came, the tally was grim across Texas. Most of the cattle empires built on borrowed money and speculation were gone. The Pitchfork, battered but intact, stood as proof that patience and discipline could outlast even the harshest winter. In the years that followed, the ranch kept growing, adding land, rebuilding herds, and doubling down on the code set in that St. Louis charter. The Great Die-Up had rewritten the rules of ranching, but at the Pitchfork, those rules had been written down from the start. Survival here was no accident. It was the result of choices made before the first snow ever fell. Every morning before sunrise, the bunkhouse stirs to life. Boots thump the old floorboards, spurs clink in the hallway, and the smell of coffee drifts from the cookhouse, just as it did a century ago. The table at the heart of it all is more than just furniture. It's a living link to the past. The long pine boards are cut and joined in the same style as the original 1900 cookhouse table, where generations of cowboys have started and ended their days. Here, there's no head of the table, no special seat for the boss. Cowboys, day hands, and managers all share the same meal, passing biscuits and stories down the line. The etiquette is as old as the ranch itself. Hats come off at the door. No one eats until the blessing is said. The cook's word is law. Latecomers find their plates cold, and complaints about the grub are met with a glare that could sour fresh milk. The menu hasn't changed much. Sourdough biscuits, eggs fried in cast iron, slabs of salt pork, and black coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. The cookhouse once fed dozens during spring roundups and family reunions, its walls echoing with laughter and the scrape of chairs. Even after the original cookhouse was moved to the National Ranching Heritage Center in 2007, the tradition carried on at the headquarters. Same table, same rules, same sense of belonging. When the crew heads out, each man grabs his own gear, a bedroll, a slicker, and a set of working tack that's been broken in by years of dust and sweat. The range teepee, canvas stretched over willow poles, remains the cowboys' shelter during long days and nights spent far from headquarters. After supper, cowboys roll out their bedding on bare ground or inside the teepee, just as their predecessors did when the only light came from the stars and a lantern hung from the wagon wheel. The rhythm of the day is set by the needs of the herd, not by the clock. During spring and fall roundups, the chuck wagon rolls out across the grass, its iron wheels creaking under the load of Dutch ovens and flour sacks. The wagon boss calls the shots, and the cook's fire is the center of camp life. Cowboys eat sitting on the ground or on overturned buckets, swapping stories about broncs and blizzards, while the remuda grazes nearby. The scene could be lifted from any decade since 1883. Only the pickup trucks and two-way radios hint at the present. Despite the spread of modern technology, helicopters overhead, computers in the office, the core of cowboy life at the Pitchfork remains unchanged. 10 full-time hands cover 165,000 acres, but each one knows that the real measure of a cowboy isn't found in gadgets or gear. It's found at the table, in the saddle, and around the fire, where respect is earned by hard work and a quiet sense of duty. At the Pitchfork, tradition isn't a museum piece. It's a living, breathing code, passed down with every meal, every handshake, and every sunrise on the open range. The legend of the Pitchfork Gray Horse began not with a single stallion, but with a relentless pursuit of quality. In 1941, manager Rudolph Swenson brought Seal Brown to the ranch, a compact, steel-muscled quarter horse whose bloodline would set a new standard for ranch remudas. Seal Brown's colts were quick, sure-footed, and smart, and his daughters became the backbone of the Pitchfork's broodmare band. After his death in 1946, the search for the next great sire led to Joe Bailey's King, a stallion whose foals carried both speed and cow sense. Each generation, the ranch kept only the best: mares that could go all day, and stallions that could turn a steer on rough ground. Over time, a signature look emerged: gray coats dappled silver, black manes and tails streaming in the wind, eyes sharp with intelligence. The Pitchfork Gray became as recognizable as the ranch's three-pronged brand. Buyers came from as far as Argentina and Australia, drawn by the reputation for horses that could work cattle at dawn and still have enough left to win in the arena by nightfall. The remuda, now 80 heads strong, is a living archive of decades of careful breeding. Each colt is started on the range, learning to read cattle, cross rivers, and handle the unpredictable moods of West Texas weather. There's no shortcut to this kind of horseflesh. No feedlot, no show barn, just miles of open country and the daily work of real cowboys. The Pitchfork's horse program isn't just about looks or lineage. These horses have carried cowboys through lightning storms and dust devils, over rocky draws and endless grass. They're bred to handle the roughest jobs, roping wild cattle, dragging calves to the fire, or running flat out across a pasture with a rope in hand. The ranch's broodmare band stands at 50 strong, each one selected for soundness, disposition, and a record of performance under saddle. 4 stallions anchor the program, each chosen for traits that matter most when the work gets hard: stamina, agility, and a mind that stays steady when the herd breaks and the dust flies. The annual return to the Remuda sale, held each October, draws horsemen who know what to look for: bone, balance, and a willing attitude. Pitchfork horses have found their way into rodeo arenas, polo fields, and ranches, from the Canadian prairie to the pampas of South America. But their first purpose remains unchanged: to serve the cowboys who ride out before sunrise, trusting their mounts to get them home safe at the end of a long day. Every foal born on the Pitchfork is more than a pedigree. It's a promise kept. The ranch's obsession with quality is written in each stride and every sure-footed turn. The Pitchfork Gray is more than a color. It's a standard, a legacy of grit, and a symbol of the ranch's unwavering belief that the best horses are the ones that prove themselves day after day on the open range. Oil came to the Pitchfork in 1980, drilling deep into the Tannehill sands beneath the same pastures where cattle had grazed for nearly a century. The first wells hit strong, some flowing over 200 barrels a day, and within a few years, pump jacks dotted the range from the South Wichita Breaks to the edge of King County. More than 500 wells would eventually be drilled across Pitchfork land, with over 200 completed in those shallow, high-yielding sands at around 4,000 feet. Cumulative production has topped 1.8 million barrels from just the main documented properties, with waterflood operations keeping the fields alive long after the easy oil was gone. The numbers tell one story, but the real impact was felt at the boardroom table. The Williams family and their directors, true to the charter's old code, refused to let oil money change the ranch's DNA. Revenue from those wells went straight back into land, cattle, and infrastructure, never into speculation, never into debt. When the 1980s oil bust gutted many Texas fortunes, the Pitchfork kept drilling, kept hiring, and kept buying land. While neighbors sold off mineral rights or mortgaged their spreads, the Pitchfork held both surface and minerals, using petroleum cash to secure the future of the cowboy way. By the turn of the century, oil had become the ranch's silent partner, a source of stability that allowed the Pitchfork to weather droughts, market crashes, and the rising costs of modern ranching. The company's policy stayed the same: no acre ever sold, no outside debt, and every dollar earned, whether from cattle, horses, or crude, reinvested to keep the land whole. Oil brought change, but at the Pitchfork, it was always in service of the land and the legacy that began with a handshake and a promise in 1883. 10 cowboys, 165,000 acres, and 4,500 mother cows. On the Pitchfork, numbers like these are not just statistics. They are a daily reality. Each hand covers more ground than most ranch crews ever see in a lifetime, and the secret is not just in the saddle. Helicopters sweep low over the mesquite draws, driving cattle out of brush so thick a horse cannot pass. Pilots and cowboys work as a single team, rotors thumping overhead, riders posted along the edges, ready to turn a drifting herd or cut off a breakaway. What used to take a dozen men a week now happens in a single morning. Back at headquarters, computers track every calf from birth to shipping. Each animal's lineage, health records, and grazing history are logged in digital files, letting managers spot trends and make breeding choices with precision. Satellite imagery maps water sources and pasture health, while GPS collars monitor herd movement across the range. When drought threatens, data shows which pastures can take more pressure and which need rest. But technology here serves tradition, not the other way around. The same hands who ride out at dawn still mend fence, rope wild calves, and bed down in range teepees during roundups. The crew eats together at a table built in the style of the old cookhouse, swapping stories about rough broncs and helicopter runs. Efficiency does not mean cutting corners. It means honoring the land and the livestock by working smarter, not just harder. On the Pitchfork, the cowboy's job has always been more than chasing cows. It is about mastering every tool, old and new, that keeps this vast operation thriving. Every sunrise brings another test, and every season proves what this crew can do when grit meets ingenuity. Across 140 years, the Pitchfork Ranch has never sold a single acre or carried debt against its land or cattle, a record documented since its 1883 charter. This unwavering principle allowed the ranch to endure the great die-up of 1886 to 87, multiple droughts, and market crashes that ended most Texas cattle empires of the era. Today, 10 cowboys manage 165,000 acres and 4,500 cows using both century-old methods and modern technology, helicopters, computers, and oil revenues from over 500 wells. Yet, cowboys still eat at replica tables from 1900 and sleep in range teepees during roundups. The details of every business decision or family meeting remain proprietary, but the public record confirms that tradition and innovation have coexisted by design, not chance. The Pitchfork stands as living proof. When a ranch holds to its founding code, even the harshest frontiers can become home for generations.
Montana cattlemen thought their empire was untouchable until 1989, when media mogul Ted Turner crashed their world with a $21 million cash deal, seizing the legendary Flying D Ranch and vowing to wipe away every trace of a century-old cattle dynasty. In place of barbed wire and livestock, Turner unleashed a radical vision: restore 113,000 acres to wild prairie, unleash thousands of bison, and build an empire where business and nature collide. But this wasn't just conservation, this was war, and the old guard had never seen a threat like the one revealed inside Flying D Ranch. What could drive a man to tear down tradition and risk everything for a herd of ghosts? And what happened when the wolves came back? Ted Turner did not slip quietly into Montana. He landed like a thunderclap. The state's biggest real estate brokers got the call in spring 1989. A mysterious buyer wanted the legendary Flying D Ranch, cash, no contingencies, no drawn-out negotiations. Word spread fast. This was not some Texas oil man or a Wall Street investor. This was Turner, the brash cable king whose face was as familiar as his voice. CNN, the Braves, America's Cup. He rolled into Bozeman with a checkbook that could swallow counties whole and a reputation for doing things his way. The brokers, Joel Ledbetter and Jim Taylor of Hall & Hall, had been told the Flying D was not for sale. Turner did not care. He ordered a private tour, took one look at the 113,000-acre sweep of grass, river, and timber, and decided on the spot. He wanted it all. No haggling, no slow dance. The price? $21 million in cash at roughly $200 an acre. The Sheltons, old Texas ranching money, had set the figure high to ward off tire kickers. Turner wired the money like he was buying a yacht, not a kingdom. The deal closed before most locals even knew the ranch was on the market. Turner's presence was impossible to ignore. He strode into meetings in his signature boots and denim, talking big, laughing loud, and making it clear he was not here to blend in. He did not just buy the land, he bought the cattle, the equipment, the whole operation. But he was not interested in running it the old way. He told the brokers and ranch managers to clear out the Angus, sell the tractors, and start thinking about what this place looked like before barbed wire ever cut the prairie. The Flying D would be his canvas, and he was about to paint over a century of Montana tradition. The local cattlemen watched with a mix of suspicion and outrage. Turner was a media tycoon, not a rancher. He talked about bison and wildness, not beef prices or feedlots. The handshake deals and neighborly codes that had ruled the valley for generations meant nothing to a billionaire who closed in cash and played by his own rules. The old guard wondered what would be left of their world once Turner's vision took hold. For now, the only certainty was that the Flying D and Montana ranching itself would never be the same. Coffee shops in Gallatin Gateway buzzed with speculation the morning after news broke. Some said Turner was just another city slicker with too much money and not enough sense. Others muttered that he would turn the valley into a playground for celebrities and environmentalists. By noon, the Flying D was the only topic at the feed store. Old-timers compared the ranch to Texas's King Ranch, but said at least the King Ranch ran cattle. Here, a billionaire had bought a kingdom and was talking about erasing everything that made it work. Cattlemen from both Gallatin and Madison counties gathered at the stock growers' meeting, jaws set, eyes narrowed. The president of the local association called Turner's plans a slap in the face to every working rancher. Rumors spread that he planned to let bison roam free, with no fences to keep them off neighboring land. Folks worried about disease, about bison busting through fences, about wolves following the herds. One rancher told the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, "If he doesn't want to run cows, fine, but you can't just toss out 100 years of hard work and expect the rest of us to cheer." Over at the Blue Moon Cafe, the talk turned sharp. Some feared property values would skyrocket, pushing out families who had worked this land for generations. Others wondered if Turner would block access to public fishing spots along the Madison. Every story grew in the retelling. Turner was bringing in movie stars, banning hunting, maybe even paving the road to Spanish Creek. A few saw opportunity. Maybe he would hire more hands or pay better than the Sheltons ever did. Most just felt uneasy, like the ground was shifting under their boots. The backlash wasn't just about money, it was about pride, tradition, and the fear that a stranger with deep pockets could rewrite the rules of the West. Turner's vision threatened to upend the unwritten codes that bound neighbor to neighbor. For the ranchers watching from across the fence line, the Flying D was more than land. It was a way of life, and now, nothing felt safe. Ted Turner stood on the porch of the Spanish Creek house, a battered book of Carl Bodmer watercolors open in his lap. The morning air carried the smell of cut hay and diesel, sounds of tractors and cattle drifting up from the valley below. Ranch manager Bud Griffith and Russ Miller from Hall watched as Turner looked from the pages to the horizon and back, silent for a moment, sizing up the clash between past and present. Bodmer's paintings showed wild prairies, bison crashing through sage, no fences, no wires, just open country. Turner tapped a finger on a print of Montana's northern plains. That's what I want the Flying D to look like. He didn't want a modern ranch. He wanted a time machine. The Angus cattle, the hayfields, the power lines. Turner called them out, one by one. Gone, gone, gone. That's your job, boys. Bud stared at the landscape, then at the book, then back to Turner. What do you know about bison? Turner grinned. Not much, but we're going to find out. The idea was as radical as it sounded. This wasn't tweaking a grazing plan. This was erasing a century of ranching and trying to bring back the prairie as it was before the first white surveyor hammered in a fence post. Turner wanted the land wild again, shaped by animals that belonged here long before the first cattle drive. No more rotating herds by the calendar, no more patchwork of barbed wire and irrigated fields. If the paintings showed bison, that's what the land would hold. If the paintings showed open space, the fences would come down. Griffith later recalled the moment as the day the rules changed. He'd spent his life running cattle, measuring success by pounds shipped and hay cut. Now, the measure would be how closely the land matched a watercolor from 150 years ago. Turner's vision wasn't nostalgia, it was an order. Restore the land, run bison, make the Flying D look like it did before anyone called it a ranch. For the men on the porch, it was the start of a job no one in Montana had ever tried. Work crews arrived before dawn, trucks loaded with bolt cutters, post pullers, and miles of heavy gloves. Their task was clear: erase a century of ranching, one strand of barbed wire at a time. Over the next year, they tore out nearly 500 miles of interior fencing, more than the distance from Bozeman to Denver. Every mile meant hundreds of steel posts yanked from rocky ground, wire coiled and hauled away, gates and braces stacked for auction or scrap. Some days, the crews worked through snow squalls or under a harsh summer sun, boots sinking in mud where irrigation ditches once ran. No corner of the ranch escaped their reach. The old hayfields were next. Thousands of acres of irrigated ground, once green under the steady spray of pivots, went dry. Crews dismantled pipes and pumps, loaded rusted wheel lines onto flatbeds, and stripped out the last traces of artificial waterworks. Diesel tractors and hay bale stackers, machines that had run non-stop each July, were lined up for auction, their engines silenced for good. The barnyards emptied out, corrals pulled apart, the familiar hum of ranch life replaced by the steady grind of laborers undoing what generations had built. Power lines came down too. Where wires had cut across the big valley, crews toppled poles and rolled up cable, leaving only open sky between the river and the timberline. Every structure that did not fit Turner's vision, feed bunks, windbreaks, even the odd cattle chute, was torn out and hauled away. Only the dirt roads remained, winding through a landscape stripped bare of its recent past. The cost was staggering, both in dollars and sweat. But for the men on the ground, many of them local hands who had once strung those same fences, the work held a strange kind of pride. They were not just breaking down a ranch, they were clearing the way for something wilder, something that had not walked this ground in 100 years. By the end, the Flying D stood wide open, ready for the thunder of bison hooves and the return of a prairie that did not answer to fence lines or hayfields. The first bison trucks rolled through the Flying D gates in the spring of the early 1990s. They came from all over, South Dakota, Nebraska, even Canada, each load packed with animals bred for hardiness and the wild instincts Turner wanted back on this land. Ranch hands and veterinarians worked side by side, unloading the new arrivals with a mix of caution and awe. Bison do not move like cattle. They hit the ground running, heads high, eyes wide, muscles bunched for a fight or a sprint. It took patience and a steady hand to guide them through makeshift corrals and into their new home. The logistics were staggering. Every animal had to be checked, tagged, and cleared for disease before joining the growing herd. Some brought bloodlines traced to the last wild survivors of the plains. Others came from private preserves, each animal a genetic investment in the future of the American bison. Crews worked long days, sometimes through snow flurries or spring mud, to keep the operation moving. By the end of that first year, hundreds of bison dotted the old cattle pastures. Within a few seasons, the numbers climbed into the thousands. The ranch staff, used to the rhythms of cattle drives and branding pens, found themselves learning bison behavior from scratch. Four-wheelers replaced horses. New handling systems had to be built, higher fences, sturdier gates, chutes designed for animals that could jump 6 feet from a standstill. Every day brought fresh lessons in patience and improvisation. The Flying D was no longer just a ranch, it was becoming a living experiment in restoration. Each truckload delivered more than livestock. It delivered the raw material for Turner's vision. A herd big enough to fill the valley, wild enough to shape the land as it once was. Ted Turner saw a problem most ranchers ignored. If bison were ever going to thrive again, Americans had to want them on their plates. So in 2002, he teamed up with George McCarrow, a veteran restaurateur, and opened the first Ted's Montana Grill in Columbus, Ohio. The menu was a gamble: bison burgers, bison chili, bison pot roast, served in a polished, old-school steakhouse setting. Diners in Atlanta, Denver, and Kansas City soon found bison on the menu, not as a novelty, but as the main event. The concept was simple but radical: make bison mainstream, educate the public, and create a steady market that would support conservation back on the ranch. The numbers tell the story. In just over a decade, Ted's Montana Grill sold more than 16 million bison burgers. That's not counting the millions of steaks, ribs, and even bison nachos that followed. Each burger meant another reason to keep herds growing, prairies healthy, and ranch hands working. McCarrow called it a conservation movement disguised as a restaurant chain. City diners, most of whom had never set foot on the Flying D, became unwitting partners in the restoration of the American West. They learned bison was leaner than beef, better for the land, and rooted in the country's oldest food traditions. With every order, they fueled a market that made conservation pay. The success of Ted's Montana Grill gave Turner the financial cushion to take even bigger risks back in Montana. It proved that saving a species could also mean building a business empire, one burger at a time. Wolves crossed onto the Flying D in the late 1990s, drifting south from Yellowstone and leaving paw prints where only cattle tracks had been for generations. The first sightings came from ranch hands checking fence lines at dawn, gray shadows slipping through the timber, a single howl echoing down Spanish Creek. Word reached Ted Turner within hours. Where most ranchers would have called in state trappers, Turner called his biologists. He wanted confirmation. Tracks, scat, every detail. The ranch's wildlife team fanned out, tracking the newcomers through snow and sage, mapping their routes and cataloging kills. Elk carcasses began turning up along the Madison, ribs picked clean, wolf prints circling in the mud. Neighbors braced for trouble. In town, the talk was sharp. Cattlemen muttered about lost calves and government overreach, some blaming Turner for rolling out the welcome mat. But Turner was unfazed. He told the Bozeman Daily Chronicle he was thrilled at their arrival. He'd spent years restoring the land for wild bison. Now, he argued, wolves were part of the deal. If you want the prairie back, you take the whole package, he told his staff, predators included. Biologists on the Flying D began tracking the packs in earnest, collaring a female and logging her movements as she ranged from the Gallatin foothills to the edge of the ranch's big pasture. Their notes filled with observations on pack size, hunting patterns, and den sites. Wolf behavior studies from Yellowstone suggested bison could hold their own. Herds formed defensive circles, calves pressed to the center, adults lowering their heads and standing ground. Cattle, by contrast, scattered and ran. The difference was not lost on the neighbors. As the wolves settled in, the Flying D became a flashpoint. Turner's refusal to trap or shoot the newcomers put him at odds with every rancher from Gallatin Gateway to Ennis. The tension across the fence line was as thick as the timber. The wolves were here to stay, and so was the fight over what kind of wild belonged in Montana. In 1989, Ted Turner signed away the future of the Flying D with a single stroke of a pen. The conservation easement, hammered out with the Nature Conservancy, locked 113,613 acres of Montana forever out of the reach of developers, speculators, and even his own heirs. No subdivisions, no luxury homes, no ski resorts creeping up the Spanish peaks. The agreement was clear. This land would remain whole, wild, and working, never to be carved up, paved over, or sold in pieces. The Nature Conservancy's negotiators had seen plenty of deals, but nothing on this scale, not in Montana. The Flying D became the second largest conservation easement in the state, a permanent barrier against the westward march of condos and cul-de-sacs. The terms were ironclad. Turner kept the right to run his bison, to hunt, to manage the land as a ranch, but the door to subdivision was slammed shut. He gave up millions in potential profits. Prime Gallatin Valley real estate, riverfront, timber, all of it off limits for good. The easement didn't just protect open space. It locked in the entire sweep of grassland, timber, and river for wildlife, for bison, for the idea that a ranch could be both a business and a sanctuary. The Nature Conservancy took on the job of watchdog, with the legal teeth to stop any future owner from breaking the pact. For Turner, the easement was the final word. He'd built his empire by betting on the future, but here, he was betting against it, against the temptation to cash out, against the slow creep of roads and rooftops. The Flying D would stay as it was, a single unbroken piece of the West, landlocked by law, not just by fences. In a state where fortunes were made by subdividing the frontier, Turner sealed his off forever. In 1989, Ted Turner paid $21 million to purchase the Flying D Ranch, instantly transforming 107,000 Montana acres and igniting outrage among local cattlemen. Within months, crews removed 400 miles of barbed wire and retired thousands of irrigated acres, making way for bison herds not seen here in over a century. Today, Flying D supports over 6,000 bison and anchors the world's largest private herd, while Ted's Montana Grill restaurants have sold more than 16 million bison burgers since 2002. When wolves crossed from Yellowstone, Turner welcomed them, further dividing his operation from neighboring ranches. In 2015, a conservation easement with the Nature Conservancy permanently protected 613 acres. Yet, questions remain. Some details of the easement remain confidential, and long-term ecological impacts are still being studied. What is clear, the Flying D stands as a dramatic experiment in fusing business with conservation, proving that one man's vision, backed by $21 million and relentless resolve, can reshape the American West.